in order to be like sustainably high performing, you need three things to be true. You need a narrowed focus, you need increased velocity, and you need increased standards.
Welcome back to the Troop HR podcast. I'm your host, Taylor Bradley. Today, we're diving into a topic that's the heart of every organization's success: performance. Specifically, what it means to achieve high performance at the individual, team, and organizational levels. Joining me are two exceptional leaders who bring years of expertise to this discussion. First, we have Joy Sybesma, founder of ScaleJoy, and with her, Alli Trussell, the dynamic SVP of Bilt Rewards. Together, they're here to share their strategies and lessons learned on crafting cultures of sustainable high performance. To kick things off, let's begin with the idea that performance must be clearly defined in order to be effectively measured. With that in mind, I want to start by asking our guests, how do they define performance?
We've been wrestling with this definition actually a lot. It's in the context of an individual, in the context of a team, and in the context of an organization. And the definition, I think, really is there's some nuance between each of those. But we think all of them like really work together, that like high performing individuals will do their best work on high performing teams, and organizations are made up of high performing teams. So if we really break it down to what does it mean? What does performance mean? I think it means reaching your potential. I think it means having focus and clarity of what you're trying to achieve and being relentless to get there. And I think Alli and I will really dive into a lot of what we've seen in like being the elements that lead to optimizing that or the highest level of performance.
What are some hallmarks you would notice of a high-performing individual?
Well, I think you have to take a step back. To Joy's point, it's defining performance for your company, which I think is going to be a little bit different for every single company. And so my whole theory is that everything actually centers around clarity, knowing what type of company you are, and therefore what type of people do well at your organization, and being able to identify that in a person, making sure that their motivations match up with what you're trying to drive as a company. And so it's going to be a little bit different from organization to organization, but I think something that high performers all have in common is a passion for what they're doing and like a genuine care for what they're trying to get across. They have to have, there's no high performer that isn't motivated by their job in some way. And so when you can really weave that together, when you can get the best out of people, when you can make them excited to do what they're doing and make them motivate their peers, I think that's when you sort of get to nirvana.
A great definition. Joy, when a CEO comes to you all and says, we need to start beginning to define what performance looks like in our organization, you both have mentioned that it is going to be organization specific. What are some of the questions that you like to ask executives that you work with to start to frame out that conversation?
We love this. We love these. What is your mission and what's your time frame to achieve it? I use this example a lot. I'm like, okay, Elon Musk's definition of high performance is probably going to be different than Joy Sybesma's at ScaleJoy, because he's legit like trying to change multiple industries and change the world simultaneously, right? I'm hopefully changing a little small part of the world, but it's relative, I think, to mission and time frame to achieve it. And therefore, like how much fire to turn on to getting the team to that level of performance. I had a recruiter say this to me many years ago, and it always stuck with me. She's like, every CEO thinks they're the Four Seasons when many of them in their companies are like the Holiday Inn. And it was like kind of cheeky, but I do think it's an important caveat to this conversation. It's what Alli's saying is CEOs need to like be very self-aware of themselves and their organization, of what their definition of high performance is relative to their mission, relative to their time frame of mission, and relative to like their level of high performance. I think that's something Alli and I are seeing a lot in having these conversations is we know it starts from the top. So we can expect the CEO to be baseline, but to expect higher performers than that CEO to join them in that mission is unlikely.
Yeah, I like to use like the LeBron James analogy, particularly with founders. Generalization, extremely smart people, extremely driven because like it's their thing, right? I actually expect them in many ways to be the best performer at their company, straddling across so many functions. And so if your founder's LeBron James, the rest of that team just needs to be really good, and they need to be really good at getting LeBron James the ball and being really specific about what you need to pad yourself with. And that comes from that self-awareness. But one of the things I'll always ask is, what do you look like when you're performing at your highest, potential? Because there is a lot of, that's probably how they've built the company. Those are probably things that have made the company successful. And so like my whole philosophy is not really trying to reinvent the wheel. It's let's double down on what works because we're inherently going to find people who jive with that.
And just to add on to that, if that's okay, Taylor, I was just recently writing in my newsletter literally about this topic. And one of the things I was thinking about is just how critical it is to have self-awareness of our strengths and be able to utilize them like 80 to 99% of the time in our jobs. I think that's what Alli's pointing to is founder, CEO, like at the top of the organization. We believe like the highest performing organizations have the right people in the right seat. And that means like that right seat is not just the jobs they can do, but the jobs that they're like inherently great at, and then optimizing for the rest of the team accordingly. So really understanding like what Alli's saying, that question of what do you look like when you're operating at your peak? What conditions need to be true in order for you to not only reach peak performance, but sustain it, which we could talk about more later, seemed to like center to me at least around like understanding who you are and having self-awareness around your strengths, being in a role that allows you to utilize them.
Joy, what I like that both of you hinted at is the sustainable aspect of it. And because you brought up Elon, one thing that my CEO and I talk about often is the analogy with SpaceX when we're deciding what objectives do we have? Are they the Falcon 9 objectives? Are they the immediate things? Or are they the Starship objectives? And we approach those two objectives in very different ways. Yeah, we want to end up getting to Mars, but that's over probably a decade time horizon. And so to your point, you can only put so much pressure on folks for so long until it becomes unsustainable. When you hear executives give responses to your all's answers of this upfront building out the framework, what are some areas that are red flags to you when an executive gives feedback of, oh, that it sounds like you may not have made this out as well as it should be, or this is a common pitfall we see people go into when they start to think about high performance? Alli, would you like to give some input first?
Oh gosh, I actually try not to look at anything like a red flag because I think that's an easy way out, to be quite honest. And I think anything that's coming across to you has the potential to have some morsel of truth in it. Yes, having deadlines and expectations that are totally detached from budgets and realities. Yes, we could go down that route, but I would be inclined to just actually ask more questions because, to my earlier point, usually low performance is a lack of clarity somewhere along the way. And usually it's a lack of aligned expectations.
And I would add on to that, we reference Frank Slootman's book, Amp It Up, a lot. But what I love about the framework that Frank Slootman gives is that in order to be like sustainably high performing, you need three things to be true. You need a narrowed focus, and to Alli's point, like clarity around what that focus is and why that's the focus. You need increased velocity, and you need increased standards. And I love those last two, because those tend to be the trade-offs that everybody thinks, well, of course we can do it better, but it's going to take longer. And the idea is if you narrow the focus enough, you can actually produce like at the highest caliber in a relatively short amount of time. But figuring out what the conditions are to make that true, I think is super fascinating. And I feel like 9 times out of 10, the companies, at least that I have a perch to see and to watch, are not focused enough. They're still trying to do too much. And so I feel like if we were going to say a red flag, It's more of, have they simplified it and distilled it down enough to the most important mission, the most important goals for this quarter, for this year? And that, I feel like, is where a lot of companies could focus and spend some time on if they wanted to actually dial up their performance quickly.
And I think to that point, the one thing that I would layer on to that is, particularly with highly ambitious goals, you can have the world's best athletes, and Joy and I have built a lot of theories on this. And like, you have sprinters, you have people who run marathons, but you have to break things down into slight moments where you can take a breath, where you can recognize, where you can celebrate, and you can give somebody like a quick water break before they get back into it. And I think, to your point, like the continual sprinting, nobody's actually built to do that. You have to build in these periods of rest, these periods of celebration. You can get people who can go longer, and I think we're all competing for those people. But you also have to, make the conditions right for them. And I think that's sometimes a pitfall that I see, is you're marching towards the super ambitious thing, but you never stop to celebrate the milestones.
And if I can just keep riffing, Taylor.
Go.
One more thing. Alli and I have done, I think, probably 70 versions of a deck around this. And we really fell in love with this like marathon analogy of, if anybody's, passing out at the finish line, like we haven't succeeded, like how do you actually really beautifully do the baton pass? And I ask this question sometimes in workshops. I'm like, okay, imagine we all ran a race together. We all PR'd, like simultaneously. We all hit our PR in that race. What everybody does next is a super fascinating question to ask. It'll be like, who's going to the bar with me? Raise your hand. Who needs to go to bed? I could have done it faster. And I'm going to start training tomorrow. And so I think when we spin the optics to not the lens of what the organization and the CEO sets out, like to build a company that is high performing, we start thinking about like managers and leaders and what they do to sustain high performance. I think it's actually really highly personalized. And to Alli's point, understanding what rest and breath looks like for each person. And Alli and I think have somehow thank the, whatever we believe in the universe for bringing Alli and I together. But Alli has been like truly one of my sustainers for high performance. And we've never actually been full-time employees at the same company at the same time.
But I think and just in each other's orbit in some way or another, baking up some crazy scheme.
Exactly. But I think it's super interesting. It's, what does someone need in order to, Alli, you coined this phrase a long time ago, recover in a jog versus, sprint and fully stop. Yeah. So if we can dial into what that looks like for each individual to get them to recover in a jog, I think is super fascinating.
I love that. On the analogy, some of the issues or concerns that I hear from leaders, particularly in the startup environment, is it's not for everyone. Right now, my organization is going through blitz scaling, and that isn't for everyone. So what tips or advice would you give to leaders on attracting the right folks, attracting the folks that want to run the marathon?
I'm going to go on a quick tangent here, and it's going to tie back, I promise. But I think that this whole notion of like work-life balance has always really fascinated me. I know it's a lightning round question, but it's actually the hot take that I actually take issue with, because I can't think of one thing in my life that is actually balanced. And so the fact that we're going to strive for this, and probably the thing that takes up the most of our life, save for maybe sleep, but probably not if you're listening to this podcast, it is crazy. And so I have really sort of tried to hone my approach to that, because I do a lot of identifying people who can run the marathon, or people who can sprint, or the best baton passers who can recover in a jog, and we can continue to train them and get them better. But I think it's really defining, what's your approach to work? Like, where do you want work to sit in the lives of the people that you employ? And that can be highly, highly personal. And I challenge both people in jobs, people looking for jobs, and people recruiting people for jobs to get really clear about that. And I've done that work myself. And I think the way that I think about it for myself is it's actually a really important part of my life. It's actually an important part of my identity. I like being good at my job and I like it being a part of my life. I'm of the mindset that at very minimum, and I haven't had a job where this is true, this is 40 hours of my week. What a shame to not want to invest in that. And if you think about it that way, and certainly I'm privileged, like you don't have life things that make that super challenging, and people definitely can. And people can also be like, screw this. This is totally to support my life and my lifestyle. And that is also totally okay. But if you have a misalignment there in who you're bringing in the organization and how they want work to fill up their life, you're going to have problems down the road. And sure, there's talent, there's drive, there's, endurance that can play into that. And you still might not land on the perfect person. But if people understand what motivates them and what's important to them, and you're able to ask those right questions, I think more often than not, you're going to find the people for your particular marathon, whatever that looks like.
I would agree. I think identity is really interesting. And like the identity of work being a really critical part of who you are. And obviously that can become unhealthy, right? Super relative. And, Allie and I are in very different life stages. I have 2 kids at home, and it's been very interesting, I think, navigating how both of us, like how we work. And I think to the point about work-life balance, to me, it's an integration, and it's looking at the whole of 7 days. And I think about work a lot more in the context of a 7-day work week and how work starts and stops, how I show up for my kids, how I show up for my husband, friends, etc. But I think there's something there around like where, Al, you said it really beautifully, where does work sit in the lives of people you employ? Knowing that may change over the course of time, but I feel like people who are driven and who are striving to achieve something beyond themselves, it likely doesn't change that much over the course of different chapters of life. It's just who they are. So I think finding people who have adaptability, which sounds like almost cliche to even say that anymore. It's, well, of course. But I recently was at a great event, and they had this awesome keynote speaker who basically was like scaring everybody about the rate and amount of change that's coming. And he was like, literally, adaptability is the superpower. Because the world will be so chaotic, you just have to be able to adapt it and go with it. So identity, adaptability. And then I think this kind of circles back to what you were saying before. We've been talking a lot about how, like Mr. Beast put out his onboarding document. There's been more and more of these like very explicit how to be successful within the context of my organization. I personally love it. I feel like we're earned to something of every organization is not for everyone. Company leaders, be explicit about who you are and why you are that way, and then let people decide where they're going to do their best work. We recently had a group of chief people officers together for dinner, and we asked them, like, what were the conditions when you were the highest performing version of yourself? And we got a ton of really interesting answers. But one of them was like, when my values were the most aligned with my boss. And I felt like the safety and the freedom to just run. So I think there's a lot to be said about just being explicit about who you are and what your company is so that people can opt in.
For me personally, on my journey, there was a large media conglomerate, which will remain nameless, but I always wanted to work for them because I just thought it'd be cool. And I eventually got 2 job offers from them and was able to go down to LA and meet with them. And this is where I feel like many startups give too much power to the big companies, or like the fear of them. Is I got on site. It was really cool to be on a studio lot in LA, but each job was, you're going to be operating in this box. Like we don't need you to operate outside this box. And that wasn't attractive to me at all. Like completely evaporated like my disillusion of what it would mean to work for a big Hollywood studio. And instead, I reverted back to finding opportunities that reminded me of my first job I ever had, which was a firefighter paramedic. Like it feels natural for me to be operating in the fire. And it's what I love about blitzscaling. You'd have to offer me a lot of cash to go to something where you're going to offer me operate in a box. Yeah, you could probably hit a number and I'd do it. But at the end of the day, what I'm looking for is flexibility. And I want to be able to take my daughter and my son to and from school every day. That's incredibly important to me. But I also love to grind it out. And one of my favorite episodes of a show called The Bear, which is about a Michelin star restaurant. It's just this montage episode that shows each person on how they're spending hours and hours perfecting their crafts. And again, that's not for everyone. Not everyone may want to go to a Michelin star restaurant. Someone may enjoy getting that box assigned to them and be able to leave it fine. But that talent is out there. And that's something that I feel like leaders struggle with sometimes is they have this mentality of, we have to mimic what Google is doing because that's what people want. I'm like, not actually, that all said, what are some use cases that you all have seen where you really feel like a company or a leader is just doing it right? They're holding true to what they want. You gave the example of Mr. Beast, which I found fascinating, but what other things really stand out to you of folks doing this well?
A couple examples are coming to mind. Okay, so first of all, I work with one company that is also like in blitz scaling mode, seeing a lot of success, but a lot of challenges as well. And they brought me on to help them build out their manager training program. But we didn't start from like the normal manager training program. You're going to do, feedback and how to delegate. And it's very like skill based. We started with the founder to say, what are your principles around what it means to lead here? So that as the company scales, we can basically do it in your image and do it in the way that you philosophically are aligned to. And Alli and I, this is one of our many pet projects, we founded a program called ScaleJoy, where we basically helped founder CEOs do this work. So this company, we did it. And one of the things that came out of it was this principle of we've earned the right to cultivate towards excellence in every seat. And it sounds like something that every company would say, but they, one, had earned the right, and two, it was super fascinating to see the managers of the company and how they responded to that principle. To Alli's earlier point, it was clarity of this is the bar and this is what it means to be excellent in every seat. And we expect you to be that and to cultivate a team that is that way, regardless of role or position in the organization. And I think watching not only the initial reaction of the managers, one of the things they said is, well, of course, because this is the level of leadership I've been exposed to. So one, it's super validating. Two, it's like giving people the frame so they can have freedom within the frame. All of a sudden, these people are like, wow, okay, what do I need to keep doing, stop doing, start doing to create excellence in my function? Because every other person in this organization is striving towards that. I have to do that as well. So that was a great example. And I think to sum it up, just doing the work starting at the top to identify what high performance looks like, what does it mean to be excellent, and not trying to be like every other organization, but being deeply self-aware and authentic and honest about what that is. I think sometimes we can go too far on that. So what Alli and I have found is in doing work with founders, sometimes we're basically just helping them create a user guide to themselves. But we need the right checks and balances to say, is this something that needs to apply and needs to be true for everyone in your organization, or does this just need to be true with you? So I think like having the right checks and balances and people leaders are great people to do this. And then maybe a different example is I work with a founder who took this too far and probably pulled out of really great employees and gave up on them too soon because they were missing like one operating principle that the founder believed was so critical, but probably had a blind spot around it. So I think we're seeing constantly examples, but I think everybody is wrestling with this concept of high performance right now. And hopefully this type of conversation helps people really get clear on what the definition is for them. Alli, anything you'd add?
Yeah, I actually think it's worth mentioning how Joy and I actually initially got connected. So I was very new to a head of people role at a former company. My CEO at the time knew Joy, had recruited Joy many, many times to try and take that position. She kindly refused many times. And by the time I finally took it over through a series of events and in the middle of COVID, he asked me to meet with Joy. I had predetermined that like I hated conventional HR. And so was very not thrilled to be meeting with Joy. Did. And within 5 minutes, I was like, oh my gosh, she's my soulmate. And we sort of cooked up this scheme, some of it chalk it up to it being the middle of a pandemic and us not thinking through all of the realities and all of the inputs, but it was more successful than it was not successful. And we actually built a very new approach to HR and performance within my organization at that time. And we called it performance acceleration. We ran a little startup within this company. We handpicked coaches that had some level of a coaching background, but had also done roles in the functions that we were going to have them support. And we had every single person in the organization have a chance to opt into this coaching. And we saw incredible results because every single person got individualized care into what mattered to them, what motivated them, what were their own unique blockers, and they had a space to work through it. And it's one of those things when you start succeeding at your job, it's addicting. And so it was really helping people help themselves and really helping people self-motivate. I mean, we saw deals get closed. We saw people get promoted. We had 1.80% of the organization voluntarily participating in coaching. And, look, again, it didn't work for a variety of reasons long term. But for that year, we saw something magical. And I think Joy and I have continued to build on that over, how long have we known each other? 4 years, over the last 4 years. And just to conclude it, because I know Taylor probably talking too long, is we have this kind of shared formula that performance acceleration was an example of, which is like, there's a formula for defining high performance, which is like, what are our principles? What are the stories that have shaped them? And give context into the why of those principles. And then what are the rituals that your organization is using to bring that standard to life day in, day out? And I think having embedded coaches was a great example of a ritual and something that we put in to sustain the level of high performance. So hopefully it's a helpful example that you shared.
Absolutely. I think it highlights something important that came out of the pandemic period. I think, one, there was a lot of, I call it HR drift, where I think HR way overcorrected on certain topics and issues and really became disjointed from the business. But on the silver lining side, Alli, you mentioned essentially these non-traditional HR leaders really shined in this period. They really well connected with the business to the benefit of the employees. And so that's something that I do think came out of that period of time and tied us all the way back to the beginning of this conversation, is making more adaptable companies, because that's going to be the key. I work at the bleeding edge of AI and working with frontier models. It's going to be wildly disruptive in the future. It's already causing a lot of impact now. To come in for a landing, though, here, I have 2 quick questions. Instead of a lightning round, we'll call it a concise round. Right.
And you can tell we're not very good at one sentence answers. So he's adapting.
No, neither am I. That's where I host the podcast, right? So the first question I have for the two of you, when it comes to high performance, that's a big umbrella, a lot of different topics. What is just one aspect of high performance that you each love to talk about? Just really passionate to talk about that particular piece of high performance.
Ooh, Alli, I feel like I have our joint answer.
Great, let's go.
The combination of demanding and supportive leadership. So Alli and I love Ravi Gupta, former Instacart COO, now he's at Sequoia. And one of the best short form blogs. I think it's RVK blog. Anyway, Ravi Gupta. He has one blog post that's called Demanding and Supportive. And it's essentially stories about how you need both. And I think what Alli and I have found together is that us as high performers individually, if we can call ourselves that, is that we flex between which role we play for each other, depending on the context that the other one's in. So if Allie has a boss who's really indexing on supportive, she's maybe going to lean on me to have a higher bar for her. Vice versa. Like I have leaned on Allie for the last few years, both on both sides, demanding and supportive. And so like leaders as a call to action, are you striking that balance? And that balance is likely different for each person, but everyone needs both. And if you're an individual saying, I have one or the other, you can be non-conventional in finding the people around you. They don't necessarily have to be in your hierarchy or even in your organization to round that out to give you that combination. And I feel like high performers need both.
And I think one thing I'm going to add to that is as people leaders, I think you have to be particularly adept at playing both roles. And that is something that I look for in high potential future people leaders. Can they read a situation and go, okay, whoa, I got a CEO who's really, really, really pushing. This person's right on the edge. Okay, how do I balance that? Or conversely, CEO has a long-standing relationship with this person, can't really push them in the way that this person needs to be pushed. Can you come in and do that? Because I generally look across leadership teams and people are generally better at one or the other. And it can be sometimes person specific depending on who they're dealing with. But I think that's the one caveat. I think a good people leader actually has to be able to chameleon between both.
Great. Agree with that. And Joy, to your point, I do think it's okay to recognize when you're a high performer. If you go ask LeBron James if he's going to say yes. I think there's a difference between like over ego, that can be a turnoff, but someone that's confident in their ability to drive high impact within a business, I think is something that many leaders are looking for in their organization. Final question for the two of you. Well, second to final question is, we talked a lot about what executives look for, things of that nature. What advice would you give to the individual of how to seek high performance in their own careers?
I mean, I think it starts with self-awareness. So really doubling down on what brings you joy, what you could do for hours and hours without, burning out, what interests you, what you're curious about, like really diving into the anthropology of you and what work looks like as a result of that. And then not being afraid to like go for it. I love the quote, jump and the ledge will appear. I think we need to take risks in our careers. And one of the answers from what conditions led you to be the highest performing version of yourself, we asked in our CPO dinner series, was almost everyone said it was when they were over their skis and they were doing something for the first time. So you don't have to be 20 years of experience to be a high performer. Sometimes it's like having the risk appetite and the self-confidence to say, I'm going to try.
And the thing that I would add on to that, because I think I can build with the advice that I would give people, and this is actually my answer to the best piece of business advice you've ever been given, but it's be the CMO of your function or be the CMO of your role. And what I mean by that is like a slightly altered version of fake it till you make it, which I think can get people in trouble. Don't get so over your skis that you're just lying. But storytelling is important. How you present yourself is important. The battles you choose are important. Making sure that ideas are actually connected and rooted back in the business. Make yourself look good. But that takes a lot of work, I think, is the other piece of that. And so to Joy's point, get really clear about what matters to you, what you want, and then get really good at telling people that and back it up.
And one last thing, a CEO client of mine said, Joy, I'm always thinking about the room I haven't been in yet and trying to get in that door. And I think that's the other piece of advice is be bullish about cultivating your network and up level.
Joy is a super connector.
Of course it was.
You could do a podcast on that.
But, like when just really knowing that like you are I don't know the exact quote, but like you're the sum of the 5 people that you spend the most time with. And someone said recently, I don't know any losers who get up at 5 a.m. But like surrounding yourself with other high performers in an intentional way, I think is super critical too.
Yeah.
Yeah, you said like the 5 a.m. thing. I just try to keep pace with my wife. She wakes up at 4 a.m. with a high intensity workout every morning. She's just running laps around me, but it is important who you associate yourself with. And I think back in my career, I was as reminiscing as you all were talking about this, is the roles that I'd been least satisfied in were the ones that I was trying to play it safe. It was the roles where I took measured risk, needs to be measured, that I just loved. Like in my current role, it would be hard to take me out of my current role. I'm having a blast in the next form.
Happy for you.
That's something exciting. The final question for you all, likely the easiest. Folks that have made it this far in the podcast obviously are interested in the field. How can they get a hold of you all? So the outlet is open, plug away.
Great. You can find me on LinkedIn. My last name is Russell, spelled with a T at the beginning of it.
Oh, that's good.
Yeah.
And for me, LinkedIn, Joy Sybesma. I know it's challenging. It's SY. Just go with Joy. You'll probably find me. I'll probably be in the top 10 pop up. But my company is ScaleJoy. You can find me on scalejoy.net. That we do manager training, leadership development, HR enablement, CEO coaching, etc. And Alli and I now have an invite-only dinner series called Wendy Road for Chief Performance Officers. So if anyone listening is intrigued, we'd be happy to tell you more. You can get a hold of either of us to talk about that as well.
Fantastic. Well, Joy, Alli, thank you so much for being on the podcast today.
Thanks, Taylor. So fun. We appreciate it. Yeah, this was so fun.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Troop HR podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, we encourage you to subscribe and leave a 5-star rating. If you would like to learn more about our community, please visit troophr.com. In the meantime, keep living the dream.